At 2:17 a.m. in a quiet neighborhood where the world should have been asleep, inside a small brick house on the east side, a life was preparing to enter the world. Jane, a 27-year-old mother who is also 9 months pregnant, a woman whose smile carried warmth even in her hardest days, was only hours away from delivering her first child. This night should have been about new beginnings, about family waiting with joy for that first cry of life. Instead, the early hours of this morning would hold a silence that no one in Cincinnati could have ever imagined. Why would anyone target a young mother ready to bring life into the world? What could drive someone to cross that line, to extinguish the light of tomorrow before it had a chance to shine? If this were your daughter, how would you even begin to process such a loss? Before we continue, this is the Crime Catalog. Stay tuned, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Jane grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a small neighborhood where people looked out for one another, and where the front porch was more than just steps. It was a gathering place. Her childhood wasn't marked by wealth or privilege, but it was marked by love. And at the center of that love was her mother, Terry. Terry wasn't just a mother to Jane. She was her anchor, her confidant, the person who knew her daughter's moods with a single glance. The two of them could sit at the kitchen table for hours, cups of tea cooling between them, talking about everything and nothing. If Jane carried laughter into a room, it was because Terry had taught her that even in the hardest days, joy could be a survival skill. Friends described Jane as the kind of woman who noticed people. She was the one who would stop to ask if you needed a ride home, the one who'd slide the last piece of bread across the table if you were still hungry. She carried herself with a warmth that felt genuine, the kind that wasn't learned, it was lived. That warmth grew even stronger when she became a mother herself. At just 20 years old, Jane gave birth to her son, Mike. It was early motherhood, and it came with sacrifices. While others her age were figuring out careers or chasing new experiences, Jane was working double shifts at the diner, coming home with her hair smelling faintly of fried food and her shoes soaked from late-night rain. She never let on to Mike how tired she was. To him, she was just mom, strong, steady, present. Neighbors recall seeing her in the mornings, rushing toward the bus stop, Mike's small hand gripping hers tightly. Even when her uniform was wrinkled, or her eyes heavy with exhaustion, she carried herself with a determination that was unmistakable. She often told Terry, "Mike is my reason for everything," and she meant it. Every bill she managed to pay, every meal she stretched from nothing, every bedtime story told with drooping eyes, all of it was for him. For Mike, those sacrifices were invisible, but the love wasn't. He grew up with backyard picnics, birthday candles blown out in their tiny apartment, and the comfort of his mother's arms when the world felt too big. To him, Jane was not only a parent but his entire world, protector, playmate, and home, all in one. But beneath that love, there was a quiet weight Jane carried, providing, surviving, holding everything together. It was more than anyone her age should have had to bear. And yet she bore it, because Mike's smile was enough to push her forward. Still, life does not always reward love, nor does it always protect the ones who give the most. In the years to come, Mike, the little boy who clung to his mother's hand, would be forced to hold on to something else entirely, the memory of her voice. Because at only 6 years old, he would hear his mother's screams from the other room. At 6 years old, how do you ever recover from hearing your mother's final cries? By her mid-20s, Jane had learned how to carry responsibility on her own shoulders. She wasn't looking for someone to rescue her, but like anyone, she longed for companionship. That chance seemed to come when she met Michael Warren. Michael was 30 years old, a warehouse supervisor on Cincinnati's west side. His days were long, forklifts moving pallets, the air filled with the sharp smell of diesel and cardboard. He had 2 children from a previous relationship, and though that part of his life was complicated, he presented himself as steady. He clocked in, he clocked out, and from the outside, he looked like a man who kept order in his world. For Jane, who was juggling single motherhood and long work hours, Michael's presence felt like relief. Friends recall her texting after their first date, "He makes me feel like I can breathe again." He was attentive in the beginning, picking her up after shifts, slipping a hand around her waist when they walked into a room, even making an effort to play with Mike, who was still small enough to think any man willing to kick a ball in the yard was a hero. But not everyone was convinced. Jane's mother, Terry, watched carefully. She noticed how Michael avoided long conversations about the future, how he would sit at the table scrolling on his phone while Jane tried to talk about doctor's appointments. There were moments, subtle but telling, when his eyes seemed elsewhere. A mother's instinct rarely ignores those kinds of signals. Still, Jane leaned into hope. She believed in what they could be together, and soon, their love became public. Maternity photos captured Jane in soft light, her hands curved protectively over her belly, Michael standing beside her, his smile fixed for the camera. To anyone scrolling past on social media, they looked like a couple ready to welcome life with open arms. But photos don't capture what happens when the camera clicks off. Behind the smiles, tension simmered. Michael had grown distant. He began posting comments online, half jokes, half confessions, about not wanting more kids, about looking into a vasectomy. To Jane, who was weeks away from holding her baby, those words weren't casual. They were a rejection of her dream. She tried to hold on. Friends remember her brushing it off with nervous laughter, saying, "He'll come around once she's here." She kept folding baby clothes, kept preparing the nursery, kept believing that love could carry them through. But Michael was already pulling away. The man who once picked her up from work now spent evenings out alone. He avoided conversations about baby names. The space between them grew wider, a space Jane kept trying to bridge, but one Michael only seemed to widen. Jane leaned into love. Michael leaned away, and that distance would soon become deadly. If your partner didn't want the child you carried, what would you do? Keep fighting for the dream, or walk away? When Jane first saw the second pink line on the test, her stomach dropped. It was the fall of 2022, and she was already 6 years into raising her boy, Mike, who had become the center of her universe. She wasn't sure she was ready to start all over again. The thought of bottles, midnight feedings, and the struggle of balancing work, home, and motherhood felt overwhelming. Friends remember her calling them in tears, whispering, "I don't know if I can do this again." It wasn't that she didn't love children. Jane adored being a mom, but she was realistic. She knew what it had taken to keep Mike's life stable, and she knew how thinly stretched she already was. For a moment, she thought about the weight of what was ahead and questioned if she was strong enough. But as the weeks went by, the fear began to soften. The flutters of movement inside her belly became real reminders that this wasn't just a problem to solve. This was a life growing within her. Slowly, hesitation gave way to joy. By her second trimester, Jane was laughing again, joking with co-workers about her cravings. She started filming small clips, sometimes in her kitchen, sometimes lying on the couch, hand on her belly, talking to her unborn baby as though he could hear her. In one video, she teased, "You better be nice to mommy, because you feel like the size of a whale in there." Her smile was radiant, her laughter unfiltered. She wasn't just carrying another baby, she was carrying hope. And then there was Mike. At 6 years old, he didn't fully understand pregnancy, but he knew something important was happening. He would press his small hands against Jane's belly and whisper into the skin, as though the baby could respond. "Hey, little brother," he'd say, "I'll teach you how to build Legos. I'll teach you how to ride a bike." One night, Jane told her mother, Terry, "Mike's already stepping into the big brother role. I never thought I'd see this, but it feels right. It feels like we're ready." She leaned into the excitement. She started buying onesies and folding them neatly in drawers. A crib arrived in a flat box, waiting to be assembled. She began to picture her home filled with 2 voices instead of one. For Jane, this pregnancy had transformed from fear into a new chapter of life, a chapter she believed would make her family whole. But while Jane filled her phone with videos of cravings and laughter, another current was running quietly beneath the surface. One she couldn't yet see, because for every time Jane whispered dreams of the future, there was someone else in the home resisting them. While she set up space for a new life, Michael was pulling further away, unsettled, unhappy, and unwilling to step into the role she imagined for him. Jane prepared a crib. Michael was preparing something else entirely. Why do some people choose resentment over responsibility? Saturday, March 4th, 2023. A date Jane had circled on her calendar, marked with tiny hearts in pink ink. At 8 a.m., she was due at the hospital for induction. Her hospital bag sat packed by the door, pajamas folded with care, baby clothes neatly stacked, a small blanket with ducks printed on it. To anyone who stepped inside, it looked like a home brimming with expectation. But before dawn, that expectation would be shattered. Around 5 a.m., the silence of Hidden Meadows Apartments was broken. Not by alarm clocks, not by the stirrings of children, but by sounds sharp and unnatural. Pops. Quick, snapping echoes that carried through thin walls. A woman in the apartment below sat up in bed, her heart racing. She whispered to her husband, "That didn't sound right." Another neighbor paused mid-step in his kitchen, coffee mug trembling in his hand. He thought for a second about calling the police, then told himself it was nothing. Then came the silence. A silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. When officers finally arrived, what they found inside apartment 7B would stay with them for the rest of their careers. Jane lay crumpled on the floor, her body collapsed against the carpet. She had been shot multiple times. Her nightgown, stretched over her 9-month belly, was soaked. A half-assembled crib stood in the corner, untouched. Bottles lined the counter, waiting for a child who would never drink from them. But the most haunting detail wasn't just Jane's body. It was the absence. The baby she carried, hours away from being born, was gone. In the back bedroom, they found 6-year-old Mike. He was curled beneath his blanket, his little body trembling, his hand gripping the edge of the fabric so tightly his knuckles were white. When an officer gently pulled the cover back, Mike's wide eyes searched the room before he whispered, barely audible, "Somebody hurt Mommy. She's not waking up." The words pierced through the room like another gunshot, not loud but devastating. Everything in the apartment seemed frozen. The hospital bag is still by the door. A baby swing, unopened in its box. The faint smell of powder and fresh laundry clinging to the air. It was a room prepared for life, but it had been forced to hold death. And as detectives scanned the scene, another truth hit them like ice. There were no broken windows, no shattered locks, no splintered wood around the door frame. Whoever came into Jane's home that morning hadn't forced their way in. They had walked in freely. There were no signs of forced entry. So who walked into Jane's home that morning? And does it terrify you to think danger could enter your home without breaking a single lock? In the days after Jane's death, Cincinnati grieved. The young mother, who should have been holding her newborn in a hospital bed, was instead lowered into the ground. At the funeral, Michael Warren stood front and center, dressed in a black suit, tie knotted just a little crooked. He leaned against Jane's casket with one trembling hand, as if pressing hard enough could keep her close. Cameras caught him bowing his head, holding 6-year-old Mike by the shoulder, whispering words no one else could hear. To the mourners around him, Michael looked like the picture of heartbreak, and he worked hard to keep that image alive. On Facebook, he posted ultrasound photos of the baby that would never be born. On Instagram, he shared maternity pictures of Jane, writing long captions about how she was the love of his life, how his heart would never heal. He even uploaded a short video of Jane laughing in the kitchen, her belly round, her hand brushing her hair out of her face. The caption read, "This was the last time she smiled at me. I'll carry that sound forever." The community responded with sympathy. Hundreds of comments, thousands of likes. Friends and strangers alike offered donations, food, prayers. To the world looking in, Michael was a man crushed by tragedy. But not everyone was convinced. Jane's mother, Terry, watched him carefully. At the funeral, she sat just behind him, studying his every move. She saw him hug family members, wipe tears with the back of his hand, bow his head in prayer. But she also noticed the way his eyes wandered, scanning the room when he thought no one was looking. She noticed how quickly his tears stopped when attention shifted away. Her heart told her something was wrong. That instinct grew stronger when neighbors handed over surveillance audio captured in the early morning of March 4th. It wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough. Jane's voice was unmistakable, panicked, desperate, screaming for help. Mike's cries followed, small and terrified, a child calling for his mother. Then the gunshots. Each one sharp, cracking, final. But the silence that followed carried its own weight. Because through it all, Michael's voice was absent. Not a shout of panic. Not a plea for mercy. Not a single sound of him trying to protect his wife or comfort his son. Investigators replayed the audio again and again. Some leaned in close, straining to catch even the faintest trace of his voice. There was nothing. Terry listened too. She put the headphones on, braced herself, and when the recording ended, she wept. She knew in her bones, something about Michael's silence wasn't right. Why wasn't Michael heard in his wife's final moments? Would you trust someone whose silence speaks louder than their words? Time moved differently for Jane's family after March 4th, 2023. For the rest of Cincinnati, days passed in their usual rhythm. Work, school, seasons changing. But for Terry, Jane's mother, and for little Mike, time was marked by absence. Each day was another reminder that Jane wasn't coming home. For 2 years, the family carried their grief in public and private ways. They held candlelight vigils in front of Hidden Meadows apartments, where Jane had taken her last breath. Neighbors gathered, their faces lit by flickering flames, voices whispering prayers into the cool night air. They marched with posters bearing Jane's smiling face, chanting for justice. Each anniversary of her death brought fresh tears, fresh anger, fresh questions. Terry spoke at every vigil, her voice cracking but unwavering. My daughter was about to bring life into this world. Instead, hers was taken. We will not stop until the truth is known. Her words carried pain, but also determination, the kind only a mother could summon. At home, Mike grew under his grandmother's care. He was just 6 years old the morning his world shattered. By 8, he carried memories most adults couldn't bear. At night, Terry often found him crying in his sleep, twisting under his blankets, whispering, "Mommy, don't go." Sometimes he jolted awake from nightmares, sobbing, clutching the same blanket he hid beneath the morning Jane died. Terry tried to shield him from the weight of it all, but the shadows of that morning clung to him. Teachers noticed he grew quiet when classmates talked about their mothers. He avoided Mother's Day projects at school, and though he never said it out loud, he carried the memory of those final sounds. His mother's screams, the gunshots, the silence. While the family mourned in the open, police worked in the background. Quietly, methodically, they combed through everything Jane left behind. Her phone, her laptop, her social media. They pulled Michael's phone records, cross-referenced them with cell tower data. They sifted through hours of surveillance footage from surrounding streets. The deeper they dug, the less Michael's image as a grieving husband held up. Among the files, investigators uncovered deleted text messages, conversations that Michael had tried to erase, but that left behind fragments. Angry exchanges about the pregnancy. Messages where Jane expressed fear that Michael didn't want the baby. Threads where he pressed her about his resentment, about not wanting another mouth to feed. There were also suspicious gaps, long stretches of silence where calls had been wiped from his phone. But the cell tower data didn't lie. On the morning of March 4th, Michael's phone pinged in places he later claimed he hadn't been. His alibi started to unravel. Investigators pieced it together slowly, almost painfully. Michael wasn't just unlucky, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wasn't a bystander at all. The grieving widower wasn't grieving at all. He was orchestrating. How would you feel, knowing the person crying beside you at a funeral may have caused the coffin to be there? By the spring of 2023, Two names began to surface in hushed whispers around Cincinnati's east side: Robert Irvin, just 20 years old, and Lamar Suggs, barely 22. On paper, they weren't hardened criminals. They were boys on the edge of adulthood, clinging to survival in a city that didn't always hand out second chances. Robert had been quiet since high school. He'd once dreamed of studying mechanics, but the tuition never came together. Instead, he picked up shifts at fast food counters, sometimes hauling boxes at warehouses, none of it sticking long enough to lift him out of debt. His mother worked nights, his younger siblings looked up to him, and most evenings he was left sitting on the front porch, scrolling through his cracked phone screen, wishing for a way out. Lamar was different. Outgoing, quick with a joke, the kind of man who could charm a room, but behind that smile was a trail of overdue bills and an ailing mother. His job in delivery barely covered rent, and when his mother's prescriptions started piling up, desperation hit him like a wall. It was into this vulnerability that Michael Warren stepped. He wasn't just Jane's husband. He was also their co-worker, their ride-giver, their older friend. In group chats, he cracked jokes with them. At the warehouse, he slipped Robert extra lunch breaks, told Lamar he admired his hustle. He made himself someone they could trust. But trust was only the beginning. Texts later recovered would paint the picture with chilling clarity. Michael, door will be open. Just be there at 5. Lamar, you sure she won't scream? Michael, handle it fast. No mistakes. You'll be set after this. Promises of quick money. Hints of a better job at the warehouse. Words designed to make two struggling young men believe they were part of something that could change their fortunes. The timeline was ruthless in its precision. The back door of Jane's apartment would be left unlocked. No forced entry. No alarms. Lamar would step inside with a weapon, Robert would stay outside as lookout, and Michael would play the grieving husband later, weaving himself into the story of loss. What these boys did not fully grasp, or perhaps refused to see, was that they weren't allies in Michael's plan. They were pawns. The night played out exactly as arranged. Lamar slipped in. Robert lingered near the stairwell, checking his phone every few seconds, his palms sweating. The creak of the back door, the shuffle of footsteps on linoleum, and then, the sound that neighbors would never forget, sharp cracks piercing the stillness, followed by a mother's scream cut short. In the aftermath, Jane lay on the floor, her baby gone before breath could ever fill its lungs. Upstairs, 6-year-old Mike pressed his face into a pillow, whispering to himself, "Somebody hurt Mommy, she's not waking up." When detectives later uncovered this conspiracy, the community was shaken to its core. These weren't faceless intruders from another city. They were local boys, manipulated into trading their futures for a man's hatred of responsibility. Jane's mother, Terry, would say through tears, "They were just kids themselves. But they took my child away. And for what? For a promise from him." The betrayal ran deeper than murder. Michael hadn't only destroyed Jane's life. He had dragged others into the darkness with him, leaving families across Cincinnati shattered in different ways. And yet, one question remained. Why would two young men risk their freedom for a child that wasn't even theirs? Do you believe desperation can make people follow orders they know are evil? When the case finally came to trial, prosecutors wasted no time laying bare what they believed was Michael Warren's motive. They told the jury this wasn't a mystery about masked intruders or random violence. It was about a husband who saw fatherhood as a burden, not a blessing. Michael Warren, 30 years old, a warehouse supervisor with 2 children from a previous relationship, was already stretched thin. His paychecks covered the basics, but rarely left breathing room. Friends would later recall him saying he was done having kids, that he didn't want to go backwards in life. In one text pulled from his phone, he wrote, "Man, I'm not trying to raise no more babies. It's already too much." That single line became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. To the jury, they painted a picture of a man who believed another child would drag him under. The late nights, the crying, the hospital bills, the endless cycle of diapers and daycare, all of it represented chains to Michael. He wanted freedom. He wanted control. And in the coldest calculation possible, prosecutors said, he wanted Jane's pregnancy to end before it ever began. But Jane's world told another story. In the weeks leading up to March 4th, her phone was filled with recordings she shared with friends. One clip showed her rubbing her belly while laughing about craving spicy chips at midnight. In another, she teased her son Mike about whispering too close to her stomach, his tiny voice promising, "I'll share my Legos when you come out." Her captions carried joy. Almost there. Counting down the days. Mike can't wait to be a big brother. Her life was moving toward hope, toward expansion, toward family. And so prosecutors placed Jane's optimism and Michael's resentment side by side, letting the contrast do the work. In the courtroom, they projected her maternity photos on the screen. Jane standing in a flowing dress, holding her belly, eyes shining with pride. Then they read Michael's own words from social media, posted just weeks earlier, thinking about a vasectomy. Done being a baby factory. For real. The room grew heavy. Jurors shifted in their seats. Jane's mother, Terry, wept silently in the front row, hearing her daughter's joy reduced to a husband's unwanted obligation. The prosecutors pressed further. They argued Michael wasn't blindsided by fatherhood. He was enraged by it. He didn't confide in Jane, didn't negotiate, didn't seek counseling. Instead, he sought escape. And in his mind, escape meant elimination. A detective testified that Michael had wiped call logs, deleted messages. He left a trail of careful silences. His accomplices confirmed it. He told them flatly he couldn't do another kid. He didn't ask for advice, didn't beg for help. He simply gave orders. This wasn't passion, prosecutors insisted. It was planning. Cold, methodical planning. And in one haunting line during closing arguments, the lead prosecutor turned to the jury and said, while Jane folded tiny onesies and arranged a crib, Michael Warren was arranging her death. While she prepared to welcome life, he prepared to end it. That sentence lingered in the air, hanging over the courtroom like smoke. For Jane, delivery day was meant to be a beginning. For Michael, it was a deadline. And in his mind, Jane's delivery was never going to happen. If responsibility feels like a burden, does it ever justify destroying lives? For 2 long years, Jane's family carried the weight of grief without justice. They prayed. They marched. They waited. And then, on the early morning the next month, the knock finally came. The first raid came just after sunrise. Michael Warren's quiet suburban street looked ordinary. Children's bikes on lawns, sprinklers watering the grass, the faint smell of toast drifting from kitchens. But beneath that suburban calm, unmarked cars had been circling for hours. At exactly 6:03 a.m., detectives approached his front door. A battering ram wasn't needed. The element of surprise was. A neighbor's voiceover recalling, "I saw all these men, like shadows, moving in the early light." And then, boom, knocking that shook the whole house. It wasn't normal police. You could feel something big was happening. Inside, Michael appeared at the door in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt. He looked groggy, but not shocked, as if he'd rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times. "Detective Michael Warren, you're under arrest for the murders of Jane Warren and her unborn child. Step outside." Hands visible. For a second, Michael didn't move. His eyes flicked to the hallway, toward the framed ultrasound photo still hanging there, and then back to the officers. No protests, no denials. Just silence. Neighbors whispered from their porches as he was handcuffed. Some gasped, some wept. Others shook their heads, muttering words like, "No. Not him. Not Michael." Across town, the arrests of Robert Irvin and Lamar Suggs carried a different weight. Robert, just 20, was found slumped on his mother's couch, PlayStation controller in hand. When officers swarmed in, he stammered, trembling so violently the controller slipped to the floor. An officer called out and said, "Robert Irvin, you're under arrest for murder." Robert, panicked, pleading, "No." "No, man, I didn't pull the trigger. I didn't. I swear I didn't. I just looked out." His cries echoed as his mother sobbed in the kitchen, shouting through tears, "What did you do, Robbie? What did you do?" Lamar Suggs, the 22-year-old identified as the shooter, broke down even faster. He was taken from his small apartment, barefoot, clutching a blanket. A neighbor said, "I'll never forget his face. Tears everywhere. He kept saying, 'I'm sorry, like he knew it was over." Lamar said to officers, his voice defeated, "I didn't wanna. I didn't mean. He told me she was nothing but trouble. He told me it had to be done." The words spilled out before he was even in the car, a confession in fragments. The community that had once wrapped its arms around Michael Warren as a grieving husband now reeled. For 2 years they had lit candles beside him, hugged him at vigils, shared his posts about heartbreak online. And now, they learned the man crying at the funeral may have been the reason there was a funeral at all. Jane's mother, holding a photo of her daughter, couldn't contain her rage. Jane's mother reports saying, "He stood beside me, pretending to hurt, pretending to love her, while all along, he was the one who destroyed her." News anchors across the state broke the story. Social media erupted. Friends deleted Michael's number. Co-workers whispered in shock, replaying every conversation, wondering how they'd missed the signs. Arrest is only the beginning. To convict Michael Warren, prosecutors needed more than suspicion. They needed proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that proof would come at a heavy cost. A mask can be worn for weeks, for months, even for years. But when it finally falls, can you ever trust another mask again? When someone you believed was broken by grief is revealed as the cause of it, what does that do to your trust in people? The case that had haunted Cincinnati for years finally entered the place where truth and lies collide, the courtroom. From the moment the first jurors walked in, the weight of the decision ahead of them was clear. The marble halls echoed with footsteps, and the benches creaked as families sat shoulder to shoulder, bracing themselves for the weeks to come. Jury selection alone carried tension. Ordinary men and women were asked extraordinary questions. Could they look at pictures of a young mother murdered before bringing life into the world and not let emotion guide them? Could they listen to the screams of a dying woman without rushing to judgment? Some shook their heads with tears in their eyes. Others insisted they could remain neutral. One by one, 12 people were chosen, strangers now responsible for deciding the fate of Michael Warren. The prosecution wasted no time in painting him as a man who made a cold, deliberate choice. "This is not about grief," they began, voice firm, eyes locked on the jurors. "This is about calculation. This is about a man who did not want another child and instead of walking away, chose murder." They promised texts, cell tower data, accomplices, and the sound of Jane's final moments, evidence that would strip away Michael's mask of grief. The defense countered with a portrait of a devastated husband. Michael, they said, had no criminal record, no history of violence, nothing but love for his family. They argued the state was leaning on the words of desperate young men who had every reason to lie. Michael Warren is a husband, a father. He sat with you in grief. He buried his wife with you. Do not confuse sorrow with guilt. They pointed at him at the defense table, where he sat in a grey suit, his posture stiff, his eyes sometimes fixed on the jury, other times cast down to the table as if avoiding the stares that burned into him. As the trial unfolded, each day carried its own sharp beats of drama. Detectives led the jury through the timeline, displaying texts that showed coordination with Robert Irvin and Lamar Suggs. A message: "Back door is open." Another: "Now." GPS records placed Michael away from his home at the exact time Jane was shot. Then came the audio, a neighbor's surveillance device that had captured the unthinkable. Jane's voice, panicked, screaming. The sound of gunfire, brutal and final. And then, the softest sound of all, her son whispering, "Somebody hurt Mommy. She's not waking up." The clip played only once, but its echo lingered. Jurors sat frozen, hands over their mouths. one woman trembling as tears streamed down her face. Jane's mother broke down, clutching the photo she held throughout the trial. Michael sat motionless, jaw set tight, offering nothing. Witnesses deepened the picture. Jane's mother testified through cracked voice and clenched hands. Only a monster could do this. Only someone without a soul. The gallery murmured, the judge calling for order. Later, the prosecution's star witnesses took the stand. Robert, the lookout, and Lamar, the shooter. Both young, both nervous, both broken. Lamar's voice shook as he admitted the truth. He told us, she was holding him back, that the baby wasn't his future. He said it'd be quick. Promised us money. He kept his head low, refusing to meet Michael's eyes. The defense pounced. They tore at inconsistencies in Lamar's account, reminding the jury he was testifying for a deal. He'll say anything to save himself, the lawyer argued. They showed the jury photos of Michael holding Jane's mother's hand at the funeral, posts of him online writing about his heartbreak. Is this the face of a killer, or of a man destroyed by tragedy? The defense leaned hard on the absence of direct physical evidence tying Michael to the gun. No fingerprints. No weapon. Just the words of men who stand to gain their freedom. But the prosecution hammered back each point. Funeral hugs do not erase phone records. Online tears do not unlock back doors. Grief does not explain coordination with a killer. The courtroom grew into a stage where one narrative clashed violently with the other. Every objection, every gasp, every pounding gavel added to the tension. Jurors scribbled notes, some exchanging quick glances as if searching each other for answers. Michael's presence throughout the trial became its own kind of testimony. He seldom spoke, but his silence spoke volumes. When the audio of Jane's screams played, he didn't flinch. When her mother cried out on the stand, he turned his face away. And when Lamar pointed at him and called him the man who planned it all, Michael leaned back, his lips pursed tight, as though daring anyone to believe otherwise. As the weeks stretched on, the question grew heavier, pressing down on the jury, the families, the entire courtroom. Was Michael Warren a man destroyed by circumstance, or the architect of his wife's murder? The prosecution told them evidence never lies, but people do. The defense told them grief should not be mistaken for guilt. And somewhere between the tears, the texts, and the silence, 12 strangers would have to decide which voice was true. The narrator's voice lingered as the chapter closed. The jury would soon decide if Michael Warren was the victim of betrayal or its very mastermind, and their answer would determine whether justice was finally delivered, or forever denied. The jury room was silent at first, heavy with the weight of 12 strangers carrying the burden of judgment. They sifted through binders of transcripts, photographs of Jane's bloodied bedroom, and the timeline that showed Michael's lies unraveling minute by minute. Some jurors were ready to call him guilty from the start. Others clung to hesitation, whispering about Michael's lack of criminal history, about how convincingly he had played the grieving widower. Voices rose and fell. One woman asked, "What if we're wrong? What if grief makes a man look guilty?" Another slammed her hand on the table, pointing at the transcript of Jane's final scream, captured faintly in the neighbor's recording. "You don't fake that," she said. Hours stretched into days, tension pressing the air like a storm refusing to break. When they finally filed back into the courtroom, the gallery seemed to hold its breath. Jane's mother clutched her rosary so tightly the beads left imprints in her skin. Michael sat stone-faced at the defense table, his hands folded too neatly, as if still trying to control the narrative. Robert twitched nervously, eyes darting toward the jury box, while Lamar muttered a quiet prayer under his breath. The foreperson rose, voice trembling, and read the verdicts one by one. On both counts of murder. Guilty. The words ripped through the courtroom. Jane's family collapsed into sobs, the sound raw and unrestrained, years of anguish breaking free at once. Her father bent forward, face buried in his palms, shoulders shaking violently. Her younger sister whispered, "We got her justice," though her tears betrayed how hollow the word felt. Across the aisle, Michael didn't flinch. His gaze stayed fixed on some invisible point on the wall. his face an unreadable mask. Robert cursed under his breath, slamming his fist on the table before guards restrained him. Lamar bowed his head, whispering, "God, forgive me." The judge thanked the jurors for their service, but the room's energy had shifted. Justice had been spoken, yet the air was thick with something unresolved. The gavel's sharp crack marked the end, but it felt less like closure and more like an open wound acknowledged. Justice, in its coldest form, was delivered. But in the pew where Jane's mother wept for a daughter she would never hug again, and in the echo of an unborn child's silence, the question loomed larger than any verdict. If a courtroom can convict a man, can it ever heal the hole he leaves behind? And when justice feels so small beside the weight of 2 stolen lives, what does the word truly mean? The story did not end in the courtroom. When the verdict was read and Michael was led away in handcuffs, the cameras cut off, the jurors went home, and the reporters moved on to the next headline. But for those left behind, the real battle was only beginning. Terry, Jane's mother, now carried the responsibility of raising her grandson, Mike. He was barely old enough to understand loss, yet old enough to feel it press against his chest at night. He woke screaming from nightmares he could not explain, dreams filled with shadows and gunshots, though no one had ever told him what happened in that house. At school, he grew quiet, withdrawn, sometimes lashing out when other children teased him about not having parents. Teachers saw a child grieving, but they could not see the weight of betrayal etched into his DNA. Terry tried her best to shield him. She packed his lunches, walked him to the bus, and sat with him through endless therapy sessions. But she knew there were wounds no amount of love could fully close. Every birthday candle he blew out, every scraped knee she kissed, was haunted by the knowledge that Jane should have been there. His father should have been there too, but he had chosen destruction over responsibility. That choice became the boy's inheritance. Later on, Jane and her unborn baby were finally laid to rest together. The family insisted on a single coffin, their lives intertwined in death as they had been in life. It was a sight that seared itself into the minds of everyone who stood there. A young woman in her hospital gown, a tiny blanket folded beside her, a promise of life buried before it even had a chance to cry. At the graveside, Terry leaned close, pressing her lips to the coffin's polished surface. "Your life mattered." "His life mattered," she whispered, her words breaking apart in the breeze. She hoped her grandson, too young to understand now, would one day know those words were true. The impact stretched further than their family. Friends, neighbors, even strangers who followed the trial online, found themselves questioning the very nature of trust. How could a man smile at his wife's baby shower, then unlock a back door to her killers weeks later? How could he cradle her belly in public, then conspire to erase her and the life inside? The betrayal wasn't just of Jane, it was of everyone who believed in him. In that betrayal, the community felt its own bonds strained. People locked their doors tighter, doubted their loved ones more deeply, wondered if love itself was as fragile as it seemed inside that house on a summer morning in Cincinnati. Generational trauma, experts would later call it. A cycle of pain passed down, where a child grows up not only with the absence of a parent, but also with a heavy knowledge of why. Mike would grow older with questions that might never have answers. Was he cursed by his father's sins? Was his existence the reason his mother was taken from him? Terry feared those questions more than anything, because she knew they had no simple truths to offer. And so, the story returns to where it began. Those gunshots that shattered the quiet morning, the cries that echoed through the neighborhood, the silence of Michael, sitting in the shadows, while Jane's voice was torn from her throat. The prologue was no mystery, it was a puzzle. Now the pieces have been laid in order, the picture revealed in its horrifying clarity. Now you know what really happened that morning in Cincinnati. A family broken, a trust destroyed, a love twisted into betrayal. 2 lives ended, 1 boy left to carry the weight of what should have been. If love can be destroyed by fear of responsibility, what does that say about the strength of the bonds we trust most? This has been the Crime Catalog. If you made it this far, thank you for riding with us, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to hear the stories that must be told. And most importantly, Share this video.